Welcome to our deep dive into the world of modern autocracies. We're going beyond those old school images of like dictators in military uniforms because things have gotten a lot more complicated, a lot more subtle. And we're looking at excerpts from Anne Applebaum's book Autocracy, Inc., which dives into how these regimes are operating more like a network of corporations. They're all about wealth and power. And they've figured out how to work together in ways that threaten democracies everywhere.
That's right. You can almost think of it as Autocracy, Inc., a global enterprise with branches all over the world.
Oh, wow.
They collaborate on everything from crushing dissent to enriching themselves, and they often use the same tactics against their own citizens and democracies abroad.
So instead of a single bad guy, we're dealing with a whole system.
Exactly. And the way they've woven themselves into the global economy and information landscape makes them much harder to confront.
Applebaum gives some chilling examples of this in her book. Like how Belarus, under Alexander Lukashenko, stays afloat despite sanctions because of Chinese investments, Iranian diplomacy, and Russian support.
Yeah, it's fascinating how they leverage each other's strengths. Venezuela, for example, benefits from Cuban security expertise and Turkish facilitation of its illicit gold trade. It's this web of interdependence that makes them so resilient.
And what's even more unsettling is that these connections aren't limited to some far-off corner of the world. They reach right into democratic economies and institutions.
Absolutely. That's why this is something you need to understand. We often think of corruption as something that happens over there, but it's naive to think we're immune. These networks are designed to exploit the very systems that democracies rely on.
Well, let's talk about that, because Applebaum makes a really strong case that personal enrichment, what she calls kleptocracy, is at the heart of this whole system.
Yeah, it's a key difference between modern autocracies and the ideologically driven regimes of the past. These leaders aren't motivated by grand visions of utopia. They're focused on amassing wealth and power for themselves and their cronies.
And she gives that crazy example of Venezuela's currency exchange scams, where everyday people are struggling to get basic necessities while the elite are hoarding wealth in empty luxury apartments.
Yeah, it's a stark illustration of how kleptocracy distorts an entire economy and society. The focus shifts from serving the people to enriching a select few. And it's not just about keeping the money within their borders. This wealth is often laundered through Western real estate, businesses, and financial systems.
She even talks about a Ukrainian oligarch, Ihor Kolomoisky, who was laundering money through American factories and real estate. It makes you wonder just how much dirty money is flowing under the radar.
That's the scary part. These systems are interconnected, and they exploit vulnerabilities in democratic institutions. Take Kolomoisky, for example. He was able to take advantage of shell companies and lax regulations to move vast sums of money across borders. It highlights a systemic problem that allows kleptocrats to operate with impunity.
So how do these autocrats manage to move so much money without getting caught? What are the mechanisms they're using?
Well, they rely heavily on the complexity and anonymity offered by the global financial system. Shell companies, for example, allow them to hide their true ownership and obscure the origins of their funds. And because many financial institutions prioritize profit over scrutiny, it creates opportunities for illicit money to flow through seemingly legitimate channels.
It's mind-boggling how they've managed to create these intricate networks.
And it's not just about financial systems. They've also gotten incredibly sophisticated at controlling information and shaping narratives.
You mean like China's Great Firewall?
Exactly. Initially built with help from Western tech companies, by the way.
Oh, wow.
But it's evolved far beyond simply blocking websites. They now use AI and facial recognition to track citizens' every move. It's a chilling example of how technology can be used for social control.
And it's not just about controlling information within their own borders, is it?
No, they actively work to shape perceptions globally. They invest heavily in propaganda outlets, like Russia's RT and China's state media, which spread their narratives into Africa, Latin America, and beyond.
It's almost like they're playing a different game altogether.
They understand that in the information age, controlling the narrative is just as important as controlling territory. And they're not afraid to use disinformation, distortion, and outright lies to achieve their goals.
So they've got the money, they've got the information control. What about dealing with people who dare to speak out against them?
That's where it gets even more disturbing.
Okay.
They've developed a whole playbook for silencing and discrediting critics, and it often mirrors the tactics Gene Sharp outlined for nonviolent resistance.
Wait, are you saying they're actually using the strategies of democracy movements against activists?
Exactly. They've studied those tactics and adapted them for their own purposes.
Huh.
It's a twisted kind of genius.
Applebaum gives some really unsettling examples, like how they use false accusations of corruption and financial crimes to discredit opposition figures in places like Venezuela and Zimbabwe.
Yeah, it's about creating a climate of fear and distrust, making people believe that all politics is corrupt and that change is impossible. They understand that if they can undermine faith in the system itself, then people are less likely to challenge their power.
And it's not just about silencing individuals, is it? They also target entire protest movements.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They often portray these movements as being foreign-funded or manipulated by outside forces. It's a way to delegitimize dissent and sow division within society.
She talks about the case of Evan Mawarire in Zimbabwe, where the regime successfully used smear tactics to turn public opinion against him. It's heartbreaking to see how effective these strategies can be.
Yeah, it highlights the vulnerability of even the most well-intentioned movements. These regimes are masters at exploiting our biases and fears.
So what we're seeing here is a system that's far more complex and interconnected than we might have imagined. It's not just about a few bad guys at the top. It's about a whole network of individuals, institutions, and strategies all working together to maintain power and undermine democracy.
And the scary thing is that these tactics are no longer confined to the shadowy world of dictatorships. We're seeing them being used in democracies as well, often as a sign of democratic backsliding.
That's a really disturbing thought. We'll have to dive into that more in the next part of our deep dive.
Yes, that's where things get even more concerning, because it shows how these tactics can be used to erode democratic norms and institutions from within, making it even harder to distinguish between the good guys and the bad guys.
You mentioned that these tactics are being used in democracies as well. That's a really scary thought. Can you give us an example of what that looks like?
Well, look at Poland in 2020. Applebaum writes about a government official there who hired an internet troll to harass judges who were critical of the ruling party.
So basically using the same playbook of smear campaigns and online harassment that we see in autocracies.
Exactly. And it's not just about silencing dissent. It's about undermining trust in independent institutions like the judiciary, which is a cornerstone of any functioning democracy.
And this kind of thing isn't limited to Poland, is it?
Sadly, no. We're seeing similar trends in other democracies around the world. Places like Hungary, Mexico, and even the United States have seen a rise in these kinds of tactics.
Applebaum argues that these regimes have figured out how to use the very freedoms that define democracies against them.
Yeah, it's like a parasite feeding off its host.
Oh.
They exploit the openness and transparency of democratic societies to spread their own narratives and undermine democratic institutions from within.
She talks about the role of online hate campaigns and targeted disinformation in this process, things that we've seen play out in recent elections and political debates.
Right. Social media has become a powerful tool for autocrats and their allies. It allows them to bypass traditional media outlets and spread their message directly to the public, often with little accountability.
And it's hard to combat because these campaigns are often very sophisticated. They blend truth and fiction, they use emotional appeals, they target specific groups with tailored messages.
Exactly, and they exploit existing divisions within societies to amplify their impact.
Yeah.
They know that a polarized public is a vulnerable public.
It makes you wonder if democracy is even equipped to deal with this kind of information warfare. The rules of the game seem to have changed, and we're still playing catch-up.
Yeah, we need to rethink how we safeguard democratic institutions and processes in this new information landscape.
Yeah.
Media literacy, critical thinking skills, and a healthy skepticism are more important than ever.
And it's not just about information warfare, is it? Applebaum also talks about a more disturbing trend, the use of violence and intimidation, not just against people within autocratic regimes, but also against those who've sought refuge in democracies.
Right.
The case of Roman Protasevich, the Belarusian blogger who was forcibly removed from a Ryanair flight, is a stark reminder of this.
Right.
It was a blatant violation of international law and a complete disregard for the sovereignty of another nation.
Yeah, and it highlights the lengths to which these regimes are willing to go to silence their critics.
It's a chilling reminder that the fight for democracy isn't consigned to geographical borders.
Transnational repression, as it's called, is a growing problem. We've seen cases of exiles and dissidents being targeted in countries like Chile, Rwanda, and even Canada.
So even in democracies, people aren't necessarily safe from these regimes.
It underscores the need for greater international cooperation and solidarity. Democracies need to work together to protect those who have fled persecution and to hold autocratic regimes accountable for their actions.
Applebaum argues that we need a fundamental shift in how we view this whole situation. We can't just treat these as isolated incidents or regional problems.
That's right. We need to understand the interconnected nature of this autocratic network and develop strategies that address the root causes, not just the symptoms.
So what does that look like in practice? What are some of the specific things that democracies can do to push back against Autocracy, Inc.?
Well, Applebaum advocates for a multi-pronged approach that focuses on transparency, accountability, and a renewed commitment to democratic values. One of her key recommendations is to tackle the issue of kleptocracy head-on.
Okay.
She argues that we need to shine a light on the flow of illicit money and close the loopholes that allow these regimes to hide their wealth and corrupt democratic systems.
Easier said than done, right?
Wow.
These networks are incredibly complex and often operate in the shadows.
It's definitely a challenge, but there are concrete steps that can be taken. For example, greater transparency in financial transactions, cracking down on shell companies and tax havens, and holding those who facilitate money laundering accountable.
So it's about making it harder for them to move their money and hide their assets.
Exactly. And it requires cooperation among governments, financial institutions, and law enforcement agencies.
And what about the disinformation problem? What can be done to counter that?
Applebaum argues for greater transparency from social media companies, more effective measures to combat disinformation, and a renewed focus on media literacy.
So basically making it harder for them to spread their propaganda and easier for people to identify and reject it?
That's the idea. It's a long-term effort that involves education, regulation, and technological innovation.
She also emphasizes the need for greater solidarity and cooperation among democratic nations, right?
Absolutely. We need to present a united front against this threat, support those who are on the front lines of the struggle, and coordinate our efforts to defend democracy, both at home and abroad.
It sounds like a daunting task.
It is, but it's also an essential one. The future of democracy depends on our willingness to defend it, adapt to the challenges we face, and work together to build a more just and equitable world.
So ultimately, what does all of this mean for us, the listeners? What can we do as individuals to make a difference?
That's a great question. And I think Applebaum offers a hopeful message here.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this.
Right.
We've been talking about global networks, financial systems, information warfare. What can any one person actually do?
It's true, the scale of the challenge can be daunting.
Yeah.
But Applebaum argues that individual choices and actions do matter. They have a ripple effect.
She uses the example of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, right?
Yeah.
To show how economic decisions can have huge geopolitical implications.
That's a perfect example.
Okay.
This pipeline, which was meant to bring Russian gas to Germany, became a flashpoint for debate. It showed how easily short-term economic interests can overshadow the long-term risks of getting entangled with autocratic regimes.
And she's not just talking about energy dependence, right? It's about the values we compromise when we prioritize profit over principles.
Exactly. We need to be more aware of those hidden costs.
Yeah.
Every economic decision we make has an ethical dimension. Are we supporting companies that align with our values? Are we inadvertently funding regimes that undermine democracy?
So it's about being a more conscious consumer, thinking about where our money goes and what it supports.
It's also about advocating for greater transparency and accountability from corporations and governments. We need to demand better.
She also talks about the need to diversify our supply chains. That seems like a huge undertaking, given how globalized everything is.
It's not easy, but it's crucial. If we're reliant on autocratic regimes for essential goods, like rare earth minerals or semiconductors, it gives them leverage over us.
So it's about building more resilience, even if it means higher costs in the short term.
Think of it as an investment in long-term stability and security, both economic and democratic. And this is where collective action becomes essential. Individual choices matter, but we need governments and international organizations to level the playing field.
What would that kind of collective action look like?
Well, Applebaum calls for a coordinated effort to address issues like money laundering, tax evasion, the abuse of shell companies.
Yeah.
It would require greater transparency from multinational corporations and a more unified approach to holding these regimes accountable.
So this isn't just about individuals changing their habits, it's about systemic change.
It's both. It's about individuals making informed choices, but it also requires us to demand more from our leaders, to push for policies that prioritize democratic values over short-term economic gain.
Applebaum ends her book with a call for a renewed commitment to democratic values, the idea that the best way to combat autocracy is to strengthen democracy. That feels incredibly relevant right now.
It's a powerful message, and it means being informed, engaged citizens, holding our own leaders accountable, supporting those who are fighting for democracy around the world.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Autocracy, Inc., what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think it's this. The fight for democracy is ongoing, and it's a fight we can win. But it requires us to be aware, to be active, to be engaged. It's not about feeling powerless. It's about understanding the dynamics of this system and finding the leverage points where we can make a difference.
Well said. A huge thanks to Anne Applebaum for her incredible work and to you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll leave you with this final thought. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It demands our attention, our participation, and our unwavering commitment. Until next time, keep diving deep.